We're starting. Okay, so we're live here at Orthodox Apologetics Live. This is Deacon Joseph Swayden.
This is Hieromonk Enoch.
And we're live. So now, Father, you were talking you were talking a little earlier. Give me a second. Don't mind me. I'm eating leftover chicken. You were talking a little bit earlier about this. We were talking about Father John Beer. It seems that that's been one of the biggest things. We've seen it on Facebook. We've seen other people going, Father John Beer's a heretic. And because, he's like the dean or the dean emeritus of St. Vladimir's, right?
I believe he's dean emeritus.
Yeah, dean emeritus. And so basically, it's like questions about whether he actually believes in the resurrection. And this caused a big hullabaloo. Like, how could you say that guy's a heretic? Well, he's kind of, we talked to some people. A quick shout out to Basil who wrote at length on this. But if you could just kind of simplify what was being said there, because I read it just now on Facebook and I was dumbfounded. But it's like,
well, I'll just read Basil Polivka's what he wrote.
Yeah.
Basil Polivka says, Father John Beer is a complicated man, and like all complicated persons, it's difficult to critique his work, let alone the man himself. I therefore speak with a studied hesitance and ask for your forgiveness if I should prove wrong. I welcome you to spend the time to listen to his talks, and if you do, you may come away with a subtle impression shared by many of his students. A certain critical spirit that kills faith, that kills simplicity. It is a spirit some at the school, that is St. Vladimir's, are well aware of, yet their capacity to expel it is prevented by tenure. Father John Beer hired most of the professors at St. Vladimir's, and they share his mindset. Before saying much else, I must caution that one would be a fool to say the man is without insight or profound skill forged from a lifetime of practice study. His translations are ironclad, yet the above impression does remain. If you pay attention to his lectures while knowing something about the Fathers yourself, you'll notice a selective reading. So, for instance, when discussing the use of secular learning, he'll speak highly of St. Gregory of Nyssa's orations that praise its powers, and eschew those that in their simplicity rejects its usefulness. Yet if you know the great saint, you'll know elsewhere that he says theology ought not to be done by most, and that the word games and babblings of the heretics in Greeks ought to be avoided. He'll reference, that is, John Beer will reference the guidance offered by St. Basil to students on the proper use of Greek literature, yet John Beer neglects to mention St. Basil's dismay for his many years spent vainly studying the Greek literature. The exaltation of secular learning and the study of letters is meant in part to contextualize the Fathers and subtly permit a recontextualization in a new modern philosophical vernacular. He gives priority to certain portions of the Fathers' writings insofar as their claims agree with his preconceptions. When confronted with a passage that would seem to contradict he'll say, obviously the author isn't being inconsistent, so he'll read the challenging passage as if it were consistent with his reading of the other. As an example, when St. Ignatius speaks of resurrection as coming to belief in one section, he believes it must mean the same in another passage that clearly teaching a literal physical bodily resurrection from the dead. Well, I don't want to give the impression that Father John has no insight into the Fathers. There is something in Father John Beer, something that he himself terms rebellious. His hair is long and he wears rainbow socks under his cassocks as a symbol of his rebellion. And that interpretation comes straight from his mouth. In that light, it often appears to students that his provocative questions are in fact the content of his belief. So when John Beer says that the Gospel of Thomas might be the most historical document we have, or heavily qualifying his use of historical, or that the union of the church came out of the diversity of the original Christian community, think of Bart Ehrman's plural Christianities, he isn't jesting for the sake of learning, but subtly injecting poison into students' minds in the name of provocation. The question then is why he seemingly holds strange opinions and what, besides disposition, is directing his mindset. To get clear on this, you need to consult his sources. Heidegger, Levinas, Karl Barth, in the Phenomenological School of Philosophy. His version of phenomenology is anti-realist. There are realist versions. It is explicitly anti-metaphysical, because we just have access to our perspective. Our interpretation, he says, is the only way we can rely on. And Basil's comment goes on. If anyone wants to join the Orthodox Apologetics War Room, they can read it here. And it goes on and on to explain that what this ultimately means is that it lowers the evidence and the qualities of the resurrection, the Eucharist, and the rest of Orthodox theology. And now he says John Beer does he deny the resurrection? No,
he doesn't explicitly deny it.
Not explicitly. He seems to accept higher criticism of the Old Testament, affirming most of it to be mythological compilations that nonetheless speak of Christ once his first principle is adopted. And he also points out that Jonathan Prague and Father Stephen Freeman actually speak exactly like John Beer.
Jonathan Prague, for to be fair, is a fantastic iconographer, but that would make him a horrible theologian.
Yeah, well, I've tried to watch some of his programs, and I know people say, well, he goes right over everybody's heads. But I didn't really hear a lot of speaking that sounded like the fathers. It sounded like it was more like 19th century, 20th century German idealism or something like, German philosophy or whatever.
But he is a great iconographer.
Oh, no, so is Gregory Colorado, but, that isn't...
exactly. It doesn't mean you want to... That's exactly right.
So, we asked somebody to give us information, and he points out that John Beer hired most of the professors at St. Vladimir's, and these are the ones that deny the canons. They deny the Orthodox interpretation of limits of church. They question Orthodox interpretation of homosexuality, communion between heretics and Orthodox. And apparently John Beer said the ancient church was diverse and inclusive, and the heretics and the church never kicked anybody out.
Not until the heretics. So.
Well, yeah, and it's kind of ridiculous because Saint Alexander of Alexandria, I think it was Saint Alexander, wasn't it? Yeah, I think Saint Alexander deposed and excommunicated Arius.
Yeah.
Years before Nicaea, the house for Nicaea, and Nicaea.
But he was obviously an extreme heretic.
Exactly, exactly. That's how ridiculous it is.
Yeah, it's a ridiculous claim. Made by really that it's not the patristic standard. It is in no way, shape, or form comparable to the Church of the Fathers.
Well, I know it's. Forgive me if I sound judgmental, but when I hear about people wearing colored socks and being some older fellow trying to be rebellious, I get image of kind of like a pseudo hippie guy stuck in the 1970s, thinks he's being hip with the kids or whatever.
With like leftover issues of High Times and the other side of the, from some side of his room. I mean, it's just sad. Yeah.
Well, if the theological, and the problem is that if the mainstream theological seminaries like St. Vladimir's that claim to be mainstream Orthodox,
that's your dean emeritus, then yeah,
exactly, and those are the people teaching there. You
got a problem.
Yeah, you're there. It's already heresy there. Another issue I wanted to bring up was there was an article, and I'll put it in oracle here, and I'm going to send it to you, Father Joseph, so you can look at it as I'm going through it. That was published. I saw on Facebook. Someone had posted it, and it was posted on this Ancient Faith blog, and I think this is like a subsidiary blog of Ancient Faith Radio. And it's basically is by this Father Stephen DeYoung, who I believe is a OCA priest in Louisiana.
Are you putting it inside links, or where are you putting that?
You can put it in. I gave it. I sent it to you through Facebook.
Oh, okay.
And in it, he basically recapitulates the interpretation that Genesis 6:1-4 is talking about angels, fallen angels, taking women and having intercourse with them and producing offspring, and these are the giants.
Okay.
And he says that this was the universal interpretation. He says this near obsession has exploded as a counter to it. Says the reinterpret. He says Saint Augustine was the one who begun the reinterpretation of this verse to make all the parties involved, that is, the sons of God and the daughters of men, to be human. Well, just so people know, I'm going to read from Genesis 6:4. So we have the verse in there. And Genesis 6:1-4, it says, "And after that, men began to be multiplied upon the earth, and daughters were born to them. The sons of God, seeing the daughters of men, that they were fair, took to themselves wives of all which they chose. And God said, My spirit shall not remain in man forever, because he is flesh, and his days shall be 120 years. Now giants were upon the earth in those days. For after the sons of God went into the daughters of men, and they brought forth children, these are the mighty men of old, men of renown. So this particular fellow is saying that everybody interpreted the sons of God to be angels up into St. Augustine. That's what he says if you read the article. However, this is not the truth. St. Augustine was baptized in the year 386. Okay, that's important.
Okay.
Now, if you look in the writings of early commentaries on Genesis, for example, St. Ephrem the Syrian. All right? St. Ephrem the Syrian reposed in the year 373, 13 years before St. Augustine was even baptized. Okay? St. Ephrem, in his commentary on Genesis about this verse, says the following. After these things, Moses wrote of the offspring produced from the union of the daughters of Cain and the sons of Seth, saying, There were mighty men in those days, and also afterward, because judges went into the daughters of men, they bore the mighty men who were of old, the mighty men of renown. The mighty men, St. Ephrem says, who were born in the feeble tribe of Cain, and not to the mighty tribe of Seth. The house of Cain, because the earth had been cursed so as not to give them its strength, produced small harvests, deprived of its strength, just as it is today that some seeds, fruits, and grasses give strength and some do not. Because at that time they were cursed and sons of the cursed, and were dwelling in the land of the cursed. They would gather and eat produce that lacked nutrition, and those who ate these were without strength, just like the food that they ate. As for the Sethites, on the other hand, because they were the descendants of the blessed Seth, and were dwelling in the land along the boundary of the fence of the paradise, their produce was abundant and full of strength. So too were the bodies of those that ate the produce strong and powerful. Therefore these mighty sons of Seth went into the daughters of Cain, that fearful wanderer, and they begot for the descendants of Cain mighty men of renown. Moses adds of old, because those thus born to the descendants of Cain were like Seth and Enoch, the first mighty men of old. After Moses spoke about the mighty men who were born into the tribe of Cain, whose women, even though beautiful, were nevertheless smaller than the sons of Seth, he then said, The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was always evil. For in the years given to them for repentance, they had increased their sins. The wickedness of mankind was great in the earth, that is, evil extended and spread throughout both those tribes. The inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was always evil, for their sins were not committed only occasionally, but their sins were incessant night and day. They would not desist from wicked thoughts. So here you have St. Ephrem, the Syrian, who was not, as far as I understand, was not a Latin speaker, maybe he knew some Latin, had no contact with St. Augustine as far as I knew. He was writing and teaching long before St. Augustine was ever baptized, saying that the sons of God in Genesis 6 are the sons of Seth. All right? So obviously, St. Augustine did not change any teaching on this.
Yeah, he didn't just get
this
that.
This is already a white, now, and let me quote, now, there's other quotes from St. John Cassian, who talks about what Abba Serenus of the desert taught him when he was in the desert in
But
Egypt.
It's basically the same.
And St. John Chrysostom says, now St. John Chrysostom addresses this in 385, a year before St. Augustine was baptized, and he says that it's ridiculous, basically. He goes even further, says it's blasphemous, but he says it's ridiculous to say that angels, fallen angels, were able to copulate with women because they're not physical entities.
Now, did any other fathers hold the opposite position?
Yes. Now, you will find St. Irenaeus. I think St. Ambrose actually did believe that the angels did lay with women. Okay, so, but that's not my point. That, my point is still this, that it's not true that St. Augustine changed anything. If anything, you'd expect St. Augustine, who was taught by St. Ambrose, to just go along with St. Ambrose's view. But he didn't.
He seems to hold St. John Chrysostom's view.
And I think, and it's not, what it is that this was a common interpretation already long before St. Augustine.
Well,
right?
I think
he was just picking up on the interpretation that St. Chrysostom taught, that St. Ephrem taught, that St. John Cassian, all the other fathers taught. And it got to the point where by the end of the 4th century, almost all the fathers, by the year, let's say 400, had rejected, and I might be wrong about this, but as far as I can tell, by the year 400, nobody was teaching the view that angels physically took wives.
The whole
fallen
Nephilim
angels.
theory, yeah.
Yes, that was kind of rejected, and St. John Chrysostom was very harsh about those who held it, saying that this has to be gotten away with because it leads to all kinds of absurdities. So I'm only bringing that up, saying that when people write, what irritates me is that if somebody had just written an article and they were saying, well, you know, some fathers taught this and some taught that, but here's why I'm going to defend this view, I would have said, okay, fine. I wouldn't disagree with it, but I'd say, okay. But if you're going to say St. Augustine is responsible for all these evils, when you got three great fathers of the church before him teaching this, it's ridiculous. It's this obsession to blame everything, every single thing on St. Augustine without actually examining where he got. For example, even St. Augustine's sacramental theology, he didn't invent that. I don't agree with him. He got it from St. Optatus of Miletus.
Yeah.
So a lot of things, you know, they're saying St. Augustine like innovated. He was simply picking up on things he was taught previously. So that's just something I would point out. Okay.
Now, in looking, I'm reading this, and I'm looking at the questions. Okay. Well, first off, question: how can you hold to the Hildebrand theory? This is Danny Pipes. How can you hold to the Hildebrand theory when you have popes like St. Leo, St. Gregory, St. Gelasius, clearly claiming supremacy? The roots are there in the 5th, 6th century, in my opinion. Okay, Danny, first off, we covered Hildebrand last time. But since you're asking the same question in another form, I'll cover it again very simply. If you take the fathers out of context, then they will stop making sense. So, if I say Rome has spoken, the case is closed, I am referring to a specific case. One can find that case and what St. Augustine was talking about when he said it. But if I take it out of context and you have no context and I say Rome has spoken, the case is closed as a papist, then what I'm implying is that Rome can always close a case. And that's not true. So if you're talking about a claim of supremacy, you must once again work with concepts, with context. St. Leo, St. Gregory, and St. Gelasius do not claim supremacy in the way that Hildebrand claims, and it does in the way any pope claims until Hildebrand. In other words, it was an alien concept. So every time somebody quotes one of these fathers to you, ask for the context. I guarantee you they don't know it. And they don't know it because they're either getting it from a list of fathers, misquotations from Don John Chapman, from Jurgens. Which are those the two big ones?
Yeah.
And so basically, these guys don't know the fathers. So the reason we can hold to the Hildebrand theory is because we know history, and the people quoting the fathers wrong don't. Okay. So hope that helps.
Someone also sent me in a question via Facebook.
Sure.
And it's kind of a question we covered before, but I'll cover it again.
Why not? Yeah.
He says, Father, are the old believers heterodox? And the short answer is that I think, yeah. And the reason I say, I think sometimes you can say yes, sometimes you can say no. The reason is that the old believers essentially postulated a heretical ecclesiology. And they still technically kind of claim it. And they claim that there were no bishops in the church for about 140 years. All right. And that is from the death of, there was this one bishop who was going to support the old believers, but was burned at the stake by the czars, Bishop Paula Kolumna, I think, like in 1670 or whatever, or 1680. So, like, from his death until, who was that one Greek or Montenegrin metropolitan in the 1840s that made them bishops?
Yeah,
I think it was Ambrose or something or another.
Yeah, Ambrose, yeah, of the Bella Krinica.
And then, of course, Bella Krinica was where they did the consecration and Bella Krinica hierarchy. So they kind of claim there weren't any bishops for 150 years. The problem is that if you're claiming there are no bishops in the church for 150 years, you're claiming that the apostolic priesthood has ceased to be. Because if there are no bishops, how do you get priests? And the majority of the old believers were still claiming to have priests. And what they did is they basically bribed Greek bishops, or they deceived Greek or Russian bishops to ordain people for them or convince people to leave. And if you're like, these are heretics, how do they take them back into the church? How do you claim, and they would have like a priest, an old believer priest that was from the older times that would anoint them with chrism or baptize them, and then they'd be made a priest. I mean, it didn't make any sense. And I think Metropolitan Philaret Drozdov of Moscow who maybe I think is a saint, who I think he proposed in 1870. He says that I think I recall him having this sermon where he was taking in an old believer church, and he says that we don't want to make any obstacles if you have the same faith, and it's generally interpreted that a lot of old believers weren't really thinking things out very clearly. They were just like, I want to have the old right, and that's all I care about.
Yep.
Now, I believe Metropolitan Macarius Bulgakov, who was, I think, the successor to, I think who became with Metropolitan until like he died in 1882 of Moscow.
Yeah.
I think there's one article where he says the old believers were heretics, and he says because they have a defective ecclesiology.
Well, and
he says that. I think he says they kind of stopped teaching heresy after they got bishops because then they didn't need to pretend about all this stuff.
Right.
So the question is, are they heterodox? I think so. I think it's much more than them just claiming than just being a schism. Because if you're a schism, they're claiming to have no different belief than the Orthodox. But the Orthodox Church believes bishops are going to be in perpetuity unto the judgment. All right. So that's a doctrine of the church. You can't simply deny that bishops cease to be without turning into heretics.
Yeah.
So that's how I don't know if you'd have anything to add, but that's what I would say about. Now I'm just talking about the priestly old believers because they're the most sane ones in perspective, because you get a lot of the crazy old believers who like worship a hole in the ground or
in a wall
and things like that and such.
In any case, I think you're pretty much spot on. I think that there are some who genuinely probably do hold Orthodox belief among the priest-old believers. I think that there's definite defects in ecclesiology that had to be, corrected, and maybe.
Well, they don't care about those anymore because they claim to have bishops.
They brush them off. But as for the non-priestly ones, most of them are not. I mean, no.
Okay, Danny Pipe says, "What do you make of those who claim St. Gregory Palamas taught the Immaculate Conception? What do you make of that?"
See it. I think I'd love to see it where he said that where St. Gregory Palamas is like, yep. And in the conception, Mary was conceived immaculately. Yep, go bring it to us. We'd love.
Because a lot of times when I've heard this before,
they like to say that when she's immaculate, that means she was conceived. No, it just
exactly. She never committed a sin or something like that.
Yeah,
well, that isn't not
immaculate conception.
It's like saying she was filled with the Holy Ghost from her mother's womb. Say, well, so was Saint John the Baptist.
Yeah, exactly.
And for example, every now and again they'll find something like they were born. They were like you can find probably just as many, if not more, references to Saint John the Baptist being born without original sin as you can to Theotokos. Now, remember, to say you're born without original sin is not the same as saying you're conceived, because if you're sanctified in your mother's womb, for example, then they're essentially saying baptismal grace is given to you at like the 9th month of pregnancy or whatever. But they're actually giving you the grace. It's the Immaculate Conception is not saying. I'm not even saying that, but I'm saying Immaculate Conception is not even saying, oh, she was conceived and then she had the stuff had sin removed from her or whatever. It's saying the conception was totally unique. And as far as I can tell, the Roman Catholic idea is not ultimately based upon this idea of some idea of original sin that they claim is whatever, is based upon they feel that it's the most fitting thing, that it's giving more honor to the Virgin to say, well, obviously she has to be born immaculately, because the claims of the Roman Catholic apologists and others that, well, how could she give birth to Christ unless she had been cleansed from sin? Well, that could have happened at the Annunciation, or that could have happened at the entrance. You know what I mean? None of that has to presuppose it happening at the conception.
Danny,
again, where's the Gregory Palamas quote?
That's what Danny actually said. Okay, we need a free trial. Give me 1 second. I have to sign into script because supposedly there's this Lev Gillette wrote something. And Lev Gillette, being a former Uniate who some argue was actually a Vatican spy into Orthodoxy.
Lev Gillette or Gillette?
Yeah, Lev Gillette, yeah.
The one who walked into the cathedral in Paris and just celebrated, and that's how he was received. Yeah, that guy.
Oh gosh! Wow, really?
Yeah, exactly. I don't know. That's what I was told. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm sorry.
No, I believe you. Hold on, let me see if I have this here. All right, so in the first, Patriarch Photius. It's Saint Photius, but it already tells me what types. Let's turn to more explicit evidence. On the one hand, Palamas does not use the formula Immaculate Conception because he believes Mary was sanctified long before the primus instans conceptionis. So in other words, he believes Mary was sanctified before her conception. On the other, he states quite as categorically as any Roman theologian that Mary was never at any moment stained solely by the stain of original sin.
Well, does he give a quote? Does they give a quote there?
Let me see here. According to Mary was able to grow from a completely purified root like a spotless stem, quote, on the limits between created and uncreated. So the entire, okay, let's see what the footnote is, because the entire quote is about 8 words. And it's not a full sentence.
Because if he's saying Mary grew from an unstained root, they're essentially having to claim what? The unstained root would have been Joachim and Anna then.
This doesn't.
They claim Joachim and Anna were immaculately conceived.
Hold on, it would seem. Hold on, that can't be right, because that is here. He turns to St. Gregory Palamas. It says here it's in his 65 Mariological homilies, but the footnote number is 4. And when I checked the footnote, let me see. Hold on. The footnote is Photius Impresentazione dei Parai in the collection of Sophocles Gregorio to Palama Homila KB Athens 1861. Okay, so this is basically we have a half a sentence which doesn't say what he's saying in an obscure Greek text.
Mm-hmm.
Let me see if there's any more to this. There's got to be more to this, because that's not even a full sentence.
Yeah, I don't really like it when they give like a quarter of a quote.
Yeah, now he switched over to Manuel Paleologos. That
was a Byzantine emperor, I believe.
Yep, and he says Mary was full of grace from the moment of her conception. Well, again, quote from the moment of her conception. We don't actually know what the quote was. And that as soon as time began to exist, there was no time Jesus was not united to her. We must note that Manuel was no mere amateur in theology. Yeah, but he isn't St. Gregory Palamas. Let's continue on.
So the emperor said this. Okay, well that doesn't really mean that doesn't really mean a lot.
We're about 80% sure the emperor might have said this.
Yeah, the emperor maybe, well, not quite.
Okay, now this says Georgius Scholarios said that Mary was, quote, all pure from the first moment of her existence.
Now, there is some thought that the Patriarch Scholarios, Gennadius Scholarios, may have actually said that, because Gennadius Scholarios had originally been obsessed with Thomas, and he had been a pro-Uniate. Mm-hmm. But once he got back to Constantinople, he was convinced by St. Mark of Ephesus to reject the Unia and became one of the big supporters of St. Mark. So with Scholarios, it's very possible but then again, Thomas Aquinas didn't believe in the Immaculate Conception. So him being a Thomist would militate against that. So
let me see. He claims Kirill Lucaris said something. That's not.
Oh, who cares? Well, he's a heresiarch.
Let me see here. Gerasimo, Patriarch of Alexandria, taught at the same time that the Theotokos was, quote, not subject to the sin of our first father. Well, yeah, we would agree with that, but that doesn't say anything. And then a manual of dogmatic theology of the same century, written by Nicholas Corselus, declared that, quote, the soul of the Holy Virgin was made exempt from the stain of original sin from the first moment of its creation by God. Okay, now I don't know who Nicholas Corselus is, but I guess that is that. Okay, the point is, we were expecting St. Gregory Palamas here. We got less than a half a sentence, and literally the entire thing we got for St. Gregory Palamas was on the limits between created and uncreated.
Mm-hmm.
So this isn't exactly a great argument. I mean,
a lot of this seems to derive from a book written by a Roman Catholic priest named Father Christian Capps, called The Immaculate Conception: Why Thomas Aquinas Denied It, while John Duns Scotus, Gregory Palamas, and Mark of Ephesus professed the absolute immaculate existence of Mary.
Oh, brother. Whose book is this?
It's written by a Roman Catholic priest named Father Christian W. Capps.
Oh, boy.
So I haven't read the book, but I'm just cautious of these things.
All of these,
I've seen
this is a new thing for us, the Immaculate Conception one. We've dealt with a lot of the other ones. Generally, what we've noticed is that the quotes get harder and harder to find. Because people begin quoting from a quote from a library text, a half a sentence from a text that's almost impossible to find. In this particular case, we can say, he's arguing the old believers said in an official declaration that Mary has had no share in original sin. No one's disagreeing with that, but the problem is that's not the Immaculate Conception. So by mixing all these things together, it becomes like this thing where it looks like a really good case, but it's not. It's just really digging the dishonesty kind of deep.
Yep.
So let me see here. So yeah, ultimately you're not, I understand you're not trying to be difficult, Danny, but there was literally like a half a sentence in there that St. Gregory actually said. We'd have to see the original text, and I don't think Father Love's telling the truth, because in general, a lot of his writings were fundamentally dishonest. And so...
Okay, so we have no more questions at this point, it seems. Okay. Well,
right, well,
we got about 30 minutes left. Any other issues you want to bring up, Father?
Yeah, no, I mean, well, in the side thing, I noticed that Jay Dyer's just become Orthodox. Congrats to him. And that was one of the things. I think it was Danny who said he was like Orthodox 8 years, and I was going to bring that up, and I'm pretty sure he wasn't Orthodox 8 years. But congrats to him on becoming Orthodox.
What about this iconoclast article?
What iconoclast article?
That was posted on the forum. This Protestant scholar responding.
Oh, that was awful. I mean, that was a good example. This is a guy who claims that he's speaking from the perspective of the fathers.
But then again, he says, I don't really care about the fathers because I only care about the Bible.
Right, but he's not telling me. And the reason, it's obvious he doesn't care about the fathers because he's not quoting any of them honestly. He quotes the Synod of Elvira. And more
and though of course there's a lot of dispute about how to even read the passage in this disputed canon.
Yeah, but
okay.
No, go ahead.
Well, if you read people posted a number of actually interesting articles on this, in which the canon of Elvira can be simply read to say something like, "We do not feel it's appropriate to hang up images in." What was the interpretation given? Hold on one second.
No problem. Take your time, Paul.
Because it actually made sense looking at it. Epiphanius of Salamas. Of course, the Epiphanius quote was fraudulent.
Yeah, the Epiphanius quote was fraudulent. And even fathers in the succeeding centuries knew it was fraudulent and made note of it.
Well, this one gentleman who wrote this article on the Ancient Faith Radio blog, and it actually was very good, brings up the point that Cyprus was not under, at the time of the iconoclast heresy when it broke out, Cyprus was not under the control of either the Muslims or the Byzantine emperor, effectively. And so they could not be forced to decide one way or the other, but what did they decide? They were always pro-icon. And there was no tradition among them of being against icons. So I think a lot of these people, they're not going to be convinced unless you can produce some kind of ritual text from the year 100 of someone saying that you need to incense an icon this X amount of times, or something like that. But even then, if you theoretically could find something like that, they'd say, well, this is just corruption that began to happen from the pagan culture or something. So, I mean, literally, if they were confronted, if they were like put in a time machine and St. Paul said, yeah, we venerate images, they'd say, well, obviously, I've heard this before from Protestant ministers a few occasions when they'll say that it's only the text of the Bible that matters. The apostles could have been wrong about everything else, but they didn't control themselves when they wrote. It was like almost like auto writing or something like that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, at that point, I don't know if you can really seriously argue with somebody if they're behaving like that.
All right, so I'm looking here. Basil asked if we were going to answer some of the questions that he was talking about.
Did he send some questions?
He did on Monday. He said, I wonder if you could discuss doctrinal development in detail and how this is abused by modernists. I'm not a fan of discussing doctrinal development at all, in the sense that the church's liturgical development, when it comes to doctrinal statements and so on and so forth, the church's literary development as well as liturgical development, is a defensive one. It's a clarificatory one. It's one where basically we believe and we try to hold to what the apostles held. And occasionally there becomes a debate about what that meant, and the church further clarifies it. We can't invent doctrine. In other words, we would believe very simply in the doctrine of the Trinity in the first century, even if it was not as clearly placed as fathers put it in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, which is ultimately what led to the Arian controversy. The fathers didn't get together to decide on how it was going, the Trinity was going to be defined. They got together to explain how it's supposed to be defined. So whenever I see things like doctrinal development, the implication that in some way, shape, or form the faith was incomplete makes me nervous. And the reason I know that that's not what you meant, Basil, but the reason I bring that up is because of the fact that there is an entire theory of doctrinal development. If we look at John Henry Cardinal Newman, for example, that exists in Roman Catholicism to explain away everything. And I think you can find the roots of that in scholasticism, but that's outside of Orthodox.
Although, remember, interestingly, when he first proposed that theory, it was widely a lot of people were very hesitant about it, even within Roman Catholicism. So it wasn't received with universal acclaim, even when he proposed it and such.
Yeah.
So we can say that what the church does is we sharpen our formulation of theology, which is not the same as developing a doctrine. Or if there's a disputed question, the church has to have a council and come to a conclusion to decide between two disputed questions. But again, that's just not inventing new doctrine or coming out of whole cloth and such. Atomic Lead says, did Pope Leo III crowning Charlemagne make the schism inevitable? Was there ever a notion that some patriarch could confer the Roman imperium on a ruler? Well, first off,
actually,
I'm sorry.
Oh, I was going to say actually that in some ways it didn't make the schism inevitable. It, bless you, someone else in the room. It's just in some ways the aftermath of what happened. I mean, I hate to go back to the Hildebrand thing again, but ultimately, it's the fact that the Pope didn't crown a ruler.
Yeah, well, an important point is that the Byzantine imperial government in the 790s, and then even after that, was in fact refer to Charlemagne as emperor in the West, an emperor even of Rome, and in one case they refer to him as like Western Emperor of Rome or something like that. So they may have been annoyed at it, but they didn't see any necessary reason to not refer to a second emperor. Because remember, at one point the Christian Empire had two emperors, up until Emperor Romulus, who was like the last of the emperors in like the 460s or 70s. So there were two Christian Orthodox emperors at various points in the early history. Did the crowning? No, I don't think it made it the schism inevitable. Now, some people argue that now remember, Leo III is actually Saint Leo III, by the way.
Yeah.
That by him crowning Charlemagne, that this created a condition that would eventually lead to the Frankish people taking control of the church. I think that's kind of part of that theory. Now, that kind of goes back, I think, actually to like maybe the 1890s. Romanides actually didn't invent that. He just made it much more ridiculous and exaggerated it.
Yeah.
There were people who had that theory before. But you got
it worse.
Yeah, exactly. He just made it more, and then he added stuff about the French, the French peasants being the Romans rebelling, and the French Revolution being great and everything. It's insane.
Having like neurobiological stuff.
Yes, and you got to check your spinal fluid every morning, But no, I don't think it made it inevitable. After Charlemagne's when he died, around 815? Was it 815, 813 when Charlemagne died? You can look it up. Most of what he built kind of began to collapse almost immediately. Louis the Pious became his successor. 814. And then you have this continuous succession of like Charlemagne's sons fighting each other over who could be emperor and king. And I don't really think it had as much impact as people claim it had. I know some others will dispute that. Was there ever a notion that some patriarch could confer the Roman imperium on a ruler? I guess, I mean, technically that's kind of what, I guess that's kind of what, I don't know. I'm not sure how to answer that question, because when the emperor,
the emperor very rarely asked for the church's blessings.
Yeah, well, exactly. Technically, the emperor just took power, or he was elevated by the Senate, and the patriarch just confirmed the fait accompli.
Yeah.
For example, when the Emperor Mauritius was murdered by the General Phocas around like 600 or so, they like only like a few hours after the Emperor Mauritius was murdered, the Senate acclaimed him emperor and the patriarch crowned him. Now, now Phocas was like, well, I don't know who killed him, and like it was like this whole show about, you know, can you really prove I murdered? No one's going to claim this new general killed him because he'd have them arrested, you know. So I'm not quite sure how to answer the question. People might want to have, you know, more specific points about it, but emperors all the time would just simply seize power. So who confers the imperium then? Okay. Can you speak about a bit about the Dormition? We claim to hold the faith of the apostles, but no one writes about the Dormition until the 5th century, kind of late. I've heard Dionysius Areopagite wrote about it, but that's now been shown to be a forgery. Well, I'm confused. Do you mean the works of St. Dionysius or a forgery, or a specific text that he wrote about the Dormition is the forgery? Now, can you speak about that, Father Joseph, real quick?
Well, I mean, I don't personally think that the texts of St. Dionysius on the Dormition are a forgery. I think Danny is kind of annoyed here in this. I mean, I don't know what he's talking about with an innovation in the RCC, but they had no choice but to accept it following Vatican I. I presume you're referring to the declaration of the Assumption as a dogma, and that has nothing to do with us. The Dormition was a feast that's been celebrated in the church for over a millennium. We have the texts that you can go back where we celebrated that occurring. And you can find Western texts and Eastern texts of that. So it's not an issue of going back.
Well, Roller Roman Catholics bring this up by saying that the Dormition was a development of doctrine over time.
Yeah, but
the problem I see with this is this: is the canonization of a saint a development of doctrine? No, no one would claim nobody. However, no, you know, when Saint John Chrysostom was canonized, I know it was like an acclamation; it was almost immediate.
I think
but when a saint is glorified after a few years, okay, nobody now can be an Orthodox Christian and say Saint John Chrysostom was a heretic or he was not a saint. You're going to be excommunicated if you said that. But did we change doctrine by canonizing it just to bring up this point? No, obviously not. First, the fact that not every now I think they're trying to claim that not everywhere had a feast of Dormition until the 5th or 6th century. That doesn't really prove anything. There is supposed to be a letter that was written by the emperors, Saint Pulcheria, to Saint Patriarch Saint Juvenal, where Saint Pulcheria, I believe, asks for relics of the Theotokos. Saint Juvenal says, "Well, you know, there's no relics. She was taken after she died. Her tomb was emptied, and she was taken to heaven." Now, what they say is that, well, how could the empress not know about this? Well, there are very many explanations. One, you know, there was mass persecution in the church. Two, this could have been a local tradition, or that was a tradition that was kept in the Near East and just simply wasn't taught that widely. But once it becomes known, you know, the church accepts it because it rings true. Secondly, I'm wondering if there are not early acta that do refer to the Dormition in the 3rd century.
I think there are, but
for some reason I think that may be true, but I don't really see the concept of, you know, for example, nobody could have been you can't really be an Orthodox Christian in good standing and say that the Virgin Mary's body is on the earth rotting somewhere or even buried in an incorrupt position.
Well, nobody believes that.
Yeah, nobody. And even when they have this proclamation about Munificissimus Deus or something like that in 1950, was it 1950? It was ridiculous because the mass propers kind of got changed in the Latin Papist Church. Whereas if you look at the old, and they became ambiguous to such an extent that people started believing stuff like the Virgin never died. Where if you look at the older mass propers, especially the old collect of the old Dormition or Assumption Mass called Veneranda, is very explicit that the old collect states she did die, but she was raised from the dead. It said, "Let today's honor festival, which the Holy Mother of God underwent temporal death, yet could not be bound or holden by the bonds of death, because she bare incarnate of herself Christ thy Son, our Lord." That's very explicit of what that's teaching. And that goes back to, the Veneranda collect goes at least back to the 600s in the West. So
some of the things that you find in the church were handed down by tradition. They are not found in epistles. This is one of those things because it is one of those things where if you go back to those early centuries where there is a church built on the site of the tomb where she was raised.
Mm-hmm.
Where she was raised was a tradition.
Yeah.
And the people understood it as that. And so when we start to talk about well, how come we can't prove it within the 4th and 5th century? We can prove it by the existence of the tomb. It's your choice to believe whether or not what the people have believed there for centuries, which is that the body raised, or that you could also believe for absolutely no reason whatsoever that someone stole the body and it's hidden away somewhere and nobody knows. But that's exactly the same argument that the Jews make about the resurrection. The point I'm trying to make is, if we assume that the church, in its fundamental unity in terms of its body, has kept the tradition alive, and I'm talking about the early centuries of the church. In today's era, that's impossible. I mean, we have corpora of manuscripts, and we have virtually unlimited writing tools. That can't happen now. But the point I'm trying to make is, in those days, much of what was passed down, including the sign of the cross, was passed down through tradition. That doesn't mean it didn't exist.
I mean, it's like claiming, it's like saying, can you prove, did a local parish priest in Wales in 350 AD, could he have explained in detail the Assumption traditions? Well, maybe not, but that just means there may have been ignorance of the issue. Let me give you an example. Until around the year 900, or let's say 850 actually, in the Byzantine Church, the Gospel of John, as a rule, did not have in its pericope John 7:53 to 8:11. That is the woman caught in adultery. It was not in the Byzantine, most of the Byzantine Greek lectionaries. All right. This is why now, after that period, after the end, by the late 9th and 10th century, they began to include it in it. Now, it was always in the Latin manuscripts, and it was actually in early Greek manuscripts too. There's all this debate about why it was taken out. There's some people say it actually was an appended text, that the gospel Gospel John was how the scrolls were assembled. And there's all this interesting discussion about it. Now, was the Byzantine Church having development of doctrine in 900 when they're like, oh, looks like this pericope got left out hundreds of years ago, and it's in the Latin manuscripts and some early Greek ones, so let's put it in here, and though we didn't know about it? Obviously not. All right? That's interesting also because that the absence of the woman caught in adultery account in the Greek manuscripts in the Byzantine Church does account for why there was no commentary people in St. John Chrysostom and others about who to identify as this woman. In fact, there was no talk about it in the Byzantine Church until the 10th century because no one had the text. Although interestingly, I believe the Slavonic texts that were translated by that were later, maybe not by St. Hieromonk, but by later translators, did have the text in it. But I know that's off point. But my point is that trying to point and say, well, only people in Palestine and Syria and in places in Egypt, knew about this, that means, when everybody else learned about it and then they accepted it, that somehow this constitutes development of doctrine. That no more constitutes development of doctrine than, the church in Iraq in the 5th century finally accepting the Book of Revelation as canonical because they had questions about it before. All right. It just means things are clarified over time. Do you agree with that or disagree, Father?
Yeah, no, I think that that's not only true. I think we can go even further and say that when it comes right down to it, archaeology and other sciences, when they find all these finds, there's never been a find that the church hasn't already seen or that the church hasn't dealt with before. In other words, they actually confirm church teachings.
Somewhere in the tradition of the church, there's going to be a confirmation given. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so, it's interesting, like in Jerusalem, again, you do find that there is, you find that there is an unwritten tradition, and that's where you find, St. Epiphanius. And keep in mind, when we're talking about St. Epiphanius, you're talking about, we say the 4th century. Now, Jesus Christ's preaching and the church's preaching and the writing of the Bible didn't start at year 0. So I'd like to clarify that for a second. If you take the writing of the Book of Revelation, which is assumed to be 80 to 90, Saint Epiphanius of Salamis would have been writing around. He would have been writing around 330. Now
350. No. Saint Epiphanius was born in 320.
He was born in 320. Okay,
he was converted when he was 16, so about 350.
Okay. So the point I'm trying to make here is that that's 280 years. A generation being 20 years. You're talking about at the most 14 generations. Now, keep in mind, 14 generations, 3 to 4 generations were usually within living memory. So, in reality, you're not talking about a very long time, but they built a tomb for the Mother of God. They had they had this tradition of this. You find, you find this sort of thinking very common in that period. You don't find any fathers who teach anything other than that. You don't find any fathers who teach that she died somewhere else and her body's somewhere. And so ultimately, that's really where the tradition built itself. And I don't think that I don't think we're going to suddenly mysteriously find the tomb of the Theotokos somewhere. That, with
we have an empty tomb. We have another
with a body in it.
Yeah. And we also have, and the other interesting point about this is that there actually are church traditions that go back to the 3rd century at least, which affirm that St. John the Apostle, after he died, was resurrected and assumed into heaven also. And you find that in some Greek Synaxarions, not a lot of them, but though that was never elevated to anything anything more than widely somewhat held. For example, in the Balkans, in Bulgaria, and in Greece and Asia Minor, you find a lot of resurrection and assumption of St. John the Apostle mosaics. But anyway, interesting question to go through. I'm looking through this book called Ancient Traditions of the Virgin Mary's Dormition and Assumption by Stephen J. Shoemaker. And I'm trying to see if there's don't really have as much time as I want to, but we'll look through it later, I guess. Okay, so next question. Are you there?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. The writing of St. Dionysius reference in the early 6th century, a series of writings. Okay, so Danny is quoting somebody saying that...
He's quoting Wikipedia.
Yes. Okay. Well, Wikipedia, so what?
I mean, the point is there's the citation to it. It points back to the question of Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite. If you look at the history, again, it isn't really until the 20th century that people said, okay, well, it's definitely...
Well, the questioning of it really started in the 15th century by Renaissance Roman Catholic. There was some Renaissance Roman Catholic scholar like in 1480.
Yeah, in that part you're talking about...
I can't quite remember his name,
like Lorenzo Valla or something?
Yeah, something like that. It's interesting because I know in the previous one of the previous discussions we had, somebody was bringing forth this Aquinas article.
Yeah.
Where Aquinas
Lorenzo Valla.
Yes.
So that he was basically, but even though he wasn't able to actually identify who the author was.
Now, I think some people have theorized that some of the works of Saint Dionysius could have been, interpolated or something like that. I mean, that's theoretically possible. That happens with other fathers. But an interpolated text doesn't mean the majority of the text is fraudulent.
Yeah.
It just means you have interpolated references. Now, I cannot remember the name. John Parker, I think, he was not Orthodox. He was an Anglican historian from the like around the year 1900, and he wrote actually an interesting book defending the authenticity of the works of Saint Dionysius. And I think he references that Saint Dionysius of Alexandria in the 3rd century makes mention of the works of the divine Dionysius.
Well, I think that I like how the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy puts it on the same article on the Wikipedia, where they said it must be also recognized that forgery is a modern notion. Like Plotinus and the Cappadocian Fathers reformed, Dionysius does not claim to be an innovator, but rather a communicator of a tradition. And I think that that's kind of important, only because of the fact that I don't think that Saint Dionysius was intentionally trying to deceive people or say that he, I don't even know how many times does he refer to himself as St. Paul's convert in the writings?
It's been some time since I've read it. I think there are references to seeing to him being at the Mars Hill and to also seeing the eclipse.
Well, if he saw that, that's okay. Well, that's fine. But the point I'm trying to make is, I don't think there was any reason, if the fathers of the church accepted that the teachings within the writings were orthodox, I don't see anything wrong with that.
Atomic Lee says, didn't Vala also demonstrate the donation of Constantine was a fake? Probably also, yeah. However, I should mention about the donation of Constantine that there are sections of the donation of Constantine that go back to the 5th century. They're called the Acts of St. Sylvester. That not everything in the donation of Constantine is actually fake. Some of it, a lot of it is. Stuff like the Pope has supreme power and is the replacement for the Western Emperor. Oh, that's obviously fake. But stuff like, for example, there was actually discussion about did St. Sylvester baptize St. Constantine? And that goes back to the Acts of Sylvester from the 5th century. And I believe in the Byzantine festal hymns for one of the feasts of either for either the feast of St. Sylvester or one of the feasts of St. Constantine, there is in fact a reference to St. Sylvester in the hymn baptizing St. Constantine.
Yeah.
That's I used to have the this massive book set of that was published out of Tennessee of the whole hour hymnography for all the hours throughout the year from the Byzantine Rite. I don't know. There was we've had all kinds of problems, fire and people stealing books and things, and so I don't know what happened to parts of the book set, but I do recall that in there. But my only point is that things like the Acts of Sylvester, that's like the 5th century. The donation of Constantine is something that kind of got compiled and invented in the 8th and 9th century as kind of like an ad hoc explanation as to why the Pope had so much land, the Vatican had so much land, and also I think there probably is some truth to the fact that maybe some of the popes wanted to protect themselves from claims of the Byzantine and Frankish emperors both. Now that's not a good reason to interpolate things and such, obviously. But anyway, side point. Basil says that maybe that St. Dionysius' corpus was kept in the Academy in Athens, which influenced Plotinus and other Neoplatonists. And that's actually a very interesting point. Because I think some of the early fathers, like St. Justin Martyr and a few others, actually make the point that... Oh, my dog's barking. They actually make the point that Plato got a lot of his philosophy when he was in Egypt, and that the prophets Jeremiah and others sojourned in Egypt. So was it really the fathers taking their knowledge from Plato as opposed to Plato taking his knowledge from some maybe kind of corrupted tradition or something like that? So, any other points to make, Father?
Well, I'm taking a look here because it is very interesting to notice that Vala's argument on the donation of Constantine was on the language. Now, I'm curious as to what his logic was on Pseudo-Dionysius or Dionysius, and so that's something that I'm looking at right now, because I'm trying to understand where he got that idea. Hello? Hello?
I'm here.
Hello?
I'm here. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yep. Now
I'm here. Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, that's all right.
My dogs were barking and things. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Let me see here, because I'm fascinated by that, because he did disprove the donation of Constantine. That part is true. Now, let me see here, because he also did let me see. Well, he also called into question the system of penance and indulgences. Because I'm not even sure where he does that. Let me just take a look.
Okay, donation of Constantine, investigation, medieval use and reception. He argued in a philological study of the text, the language used in the manuscript could not date the 5th century. There was a philological argument. 8th century.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to find this. There's there's stuff here arguing that Dionysius was being used as a way to preserve Greek philosophy in the church. Who wrote that? Cardiff University. So that's interesting.
You have a lot of kind of some prominent people, I guess, kind of prominent who do attack Saint Dionysius the Areopagite. For example, Michael Hoffman will attack Saint Dionysius the Areopagite a whole lot, and I guess he attacks him because he says that the root of all evils is somehow Neoplatonism, and Saint Dionysius taught Neoplatonism, therefore it's evil. So.
Well, it's interesting here because, even Catholic authors as late as 1910 were claiming that it could very well have just been, it could have been Proclus plagiarizing Dionysius, not the other way around. So I find that it's fascinating that this was still openly, debated up until very recently, where now it's just assumed by everyone that it's pseudo Dionysius, even though that's not necessarily the case.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So let me see here. Basil uses the Orthodox New Testament from Holy Apostles' Convent. Again, I'm not a big fan of Gregory of Colorado stuff, but I will say the patristic text in those New Testament books is pretty good. Let me see. But I wouldn't put Dionysius the Areopagite, which has been recognized throughout the East as, the authoritative writer of those texts, and the donation of Constantine in the same boat, because they're very different.
Well, but here's the point. Even the donation of Constantine can be, large portions of it go back to the 5th century. So my point is that even if you wanted to say, well, there's anachronisms in the works of Saint Dionysius, anachronisms just prove that it could have been interpolated, or there could be, sections. My point is that anachronisms don't prove the body of the text was itself not older. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, I would say
the donation of Constantine can be fake, but that doesn't mean that the Acts of Sylvester, which the donation were based on, were fake.
Right, and I think that, well, in this case, it seems more like it's a question of who's borrowing off of who, and is Proclus stealing from Saint Dionysius? Is Saint Dionysius stealing from Proclus? So on and so forth.
You're right, Basil. Hoffman is so aware of Kabbalism. For example, Hoffman talks a lot about how he holds up Aquinas, but Aquinas was like pro-Dionysius. Now Aquinas didn't understand, I don't think, Dionysius Areopagite correctly, but Aquinas, just like in this previous...
he got a lot of forgeries of him, didn't he?
Well, here's my point. There's a lot of questions here. Yeah. A previous program, somebody was pointing out how a Roman Catholic writer was attacking St. Dionysius' works and saying, oh, this is evil Neoplatonism, blah, 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 and that's where we have to go only with Aquinas. Well, the fact is, if you look at Aquinas did have very good Latin copies of Dionysius the Areopagite. That wasn't the forgery issue, okay? And in those, Aquinas praises Dionysius, all right? Now, he may have interpreted him wrongly. I think he did, obviously. But so how can Hoffman, Roman Catholic apologists, and others somehow hold up Aquinas, but they think they know better than Aquinas from their own papist perspective? It doesn't, I don't think. I think it's selective quotation and things like that.
Yeah,
I think a lot of this one particular Roman Catholic apologist didn't like Saint Dionysius because he could detect the essence energy distinction in his writings, and so they had to assail. This one particular papist writer wanted to assail Dionysius simply for that reason. But then if that's the case, my question is, why don't they assail St. Maximus the Confessor, who they have to accept as a saint? So
now okay, now let's see here. It's already 9:04. We can continue this all tomorrow. We definitely got more to talk about. It gives us more to look at, and we'll continue the saga of St. Dionysius and Proclus and all that fun stuff. And more questions, as always. We don't shy away from questions here. I think we've proven that today. Anyway, once again, thanks everyone for listening. We will be back tomorrow. Again, this is Deacon Joseph Swaden.
This is Hieromonk Enoch.
Okay, everyone have a good night. Benedicite.
Benedicite.